Hey everybody, this is writing micro lesson number 3 on sentence structure. I'm Rob Glover, and this is for Honors 111 in the Civilization sequence of the Honors College at the University of Maine. So today's lesson is going to deal with sentence structure. I know that sounds a little mundane, maybe a little bit boring, but sentence structure is a really important tool that you have at your disposal as a writer, and it can actually shape how clear your points are and how interesting your writing is for your reader. So let's talk first about why sentence structure is so important. Number one is clarity, right? Sentence structure is going to impact how clear the points you make are in your reading, how the arguments, the evidence that you're putting forth to your reader. Does it kind of jump off the page, or is it jumbled and is it confusing and just the reader kind of have to wade through in order to find what it is that you're actually saying? That in a lot of ways comes down to sentence structure. So that's really, really important. Variety. It's also how you introduce variation into your writing. And that, if you've ever thought about a piece that you've read that maybe you didn't enjoy, if it seemed as if the writing was monotonous, if it seemed as if it was just kind of repetitive, saying things in the same way over and over again, that probably came down to sentence structure. It was probably an unimaginative, uninteresting set of choices made about sentence structure that made the work appear monotonous. Sometimes something, even if we're interested in the topic, it doesn't actually interest us if the writing, the way that the author is writing about it, is not also engaging and interesting to us. So sentence structure allows you to introduce that variety. And then lastly, transition. So anytime that you're writing virtually anything, it could be a 1-page, 2-page essay, you're going to be transitioning from point to point, one section of the paper to another. And how you structure your sentences and the choices that you make in how you introduce ideas and move from one topic to another has a lot to do with sentence structure as well. So in the assignment that you write for this week, these are the criteria upon which I'm going to be really zeroing in to see how you do with utilizing sentence structure in an effort to provide clarity, to introduce variety, and to provide transition and signposts for your reader. So what I'll do with the remainder of this short lesson is to go through some of the tools that you have at your disposal and to help get you thinking systematically about sentence structure and how to utilize sentence structure in your writing. So in order to talk about that, we have to first define the different types of sentences, and there are 4. But before we go into the different types of sentences, we have to define some basic terminology, which helps us understand those differences. The first is clauses, right? So clauses, these are just groups of words with a subject and a predicate. They can be sentences, but they don't necessarily have to be. It just has to be a group of words with a subject and a predicate. We break them up into 2 different types, and what the configuration is of those 2 different types within a sentence will determine what type of sentence it is. So the 2 types are an independent clause and a dependent clause. The independent clause has a subject and a verb, and it can serve as a standalone sentence. So an independent clause can operate as a sentence all on its own. And you have an example here. The man went to the store, right? A dependent clause contains a subject and a verb, but it's unable on its own to serve as a standalone sentence. If you put this in a paper and put a period at the end of it, it would be a sentence fragment. So the example I provide here is while I listen to music, right? That can't be a sentence on its own. It needs some other clause in order to make sense. What happened while you listen to music? Well, an independent clause would have to be conjoined to that dependent clause to tell us that. So that's just some basic terminology that helps us sort out the differences between types of sentences. The simplest form of sentence is called simple. It's just a sentence with one independent clause. So an example you have here, we went to the coffee shop, right? Subject, predicate, one independent clause, function is on its own as a sentence. That's a simple sentence. Slightly more complex than that is a compound sentence, in which you're going to have at least 2 independent clauses, and they're going to be connected in some way, right? you either have a word that we call a conjunction, and there's a few examples here. There are more than this, but and, as, but, or you can use a semicolon. And semicolons are sometimes confusing, I notice, to students. When exactly do we use a semicolon? Here, you can use a semicolon to connect two independent but related clauses, right? So we'll get into that as we move into these examples, but a semicolon is a way that you can connect two independent clauses. So here are some examples. We went to the coffee shop and we found it was empty. That's two independent clauses. We went to the coffee shop, we found it was empty, and they are connected by a coordinating conjunction and, okay? That's a compound sentence. Here we have the same idea, but instead of a coordinating conjunction, we use a semicolon. We went to the coffee shop, we found it was empty. Those are independent clauses, they're related, and we put that semicolon in there to connect them in a single sentence. So that's a compound sentence. A complex sentence. Now we're moving into slightly more complex territory. That's going to contain one independent clause and one or more dependent clauses. So some examples. While we waited for our friends, we went to the coffee shop. Obviously, the first half of that sentence would be the dependent clause that can't function on its own as a sentence. That's a fragment. And the second half would be the independent clause. We went to the coffee shop. The second sentence. When we discovered the library was closed, we went to the coffee shop that I had found on Yelp. So there you have an independent clause. We went to the coffee shop, sandwiched between two dependent clauses. So that one actually has two dependent clauses. When we discovered the library was closed, that I had found on Yelp. There's a subject, there's a predicate in each of those, but they couldn't function as standalone sentences. So last but not least, we have compound complex sentences. These contain two or more independent clauses and one or more dependent clauses. Right, so here there's multiple independent clauses and there may be multiple dependent clauses, but there doesn't have to be. So as an example, we went to the coffee shop that I had wanted to visit, and then we went to the library. So we went to the coffee shop, that's an independent clause, that I had wanted to visit, right? And that is a dependent clause. And then is kind of the conjoining element there. We went to the library, another independent clause. Second example, before we went to the library, we went to the coffee shop that I had wanted to visit, and we realized it was closed. There we have independent clauses. We went to the coffee shop, we realized it was closed, and we also have, before we went to the library, that I had wanted to visit, which are dependent clauses. So here you're moving into more complex territory. You're conjoining multiple independent clauses and multiple dependent clauses. And hopefully the thing that you notice is as these sentences become more complex and you start to kind of link ideas together through conjunctions, they can be slightly harder to follow. Now, these sentences are not enormously complex, but sometimes you'll see a sentence that stretches half a page and is conjoining many different ideas with many different dependent clauses, and you have to go back and read it 3 or 4 times. That's the type of sophistication and complexity that you can get into with sentence structure, and you have to think about whether or not that is warranted and whether or not it's appropriate, and your reader is going to be able to comprehend what you're saying. So my guide for sentence structure and thinking about choosing different types of sentences is basically kind of 3 things that you should keep in mind as you're thinking about how to structure your sentences. First is you want variation, right? So if you utilize the same type of sentence over and over again, it's going to seem repetitive. And if you're using shorter, simpler sentences, it's going to seem choppy. It's going to seem very staccato, just one idea hitting you after another. So you want to vary that structure. And the goal is to be more engaging and to have a better flow, a better rhythm to your writing. In instances in which you have a lot of information to convey, and you're trying to get a lot of information to your reader so that you can move on to some more profound point, sometimes you use complex and compound structures in those instances. how can I utilize a sentence to convey as much info as possible. In areas in which you really have an important point that you want to emphasize, for instance, your thesis statement, or if you've been moving through some evidence to make a single point and you've kind of set the reader up for that point, you want to be as simple as possible. Use the simplest structure to convey that point, because that will emphasize it, right? Their eyes might kind of drift through a very complex sentence, but if you have a simple sentence, right, it will kind of hammer the point home. And so there is actually a strategy to how we utilize different sentence structures and sentence types. And so you just want to be mindful of that. You want to be intentional. There's no hard and fast rule as to how one makes these choices, but you try to find a style that works for you and feels natural, and just be cognizant of the fact that you do need to vary your sentence structure and be intentional about the types of sentences that you're using. So some other tools that are at your disposal in thinking about sentence structure. One is called a dependent marker. So these are just words that introduce a dependent clause, and there's a whole list of them here: after, although, as if. Those are useful in that they can introduce variety in sentences and avoid beginning the sentence with a subject. So you may find that as you read through your work, it seems kind of like a list. It seems as if it's simply, subject, predicate, subject, predicate, subject, predicate. And that can be kind of boring and not very engaging for your reader. Whereas if you utilize some of these dependent markers and begin your sentences with dependent clauses, that can introduce variation that will be more engaging for the reader. So there's an example here that relates to the Odyssey that we read in Honors 111. The example, he says, although many thought Odysseus was dead, Telemachus was willing to engage in a risky journey to find more information about his father's fate. Right? So you could have begun that sentence with Telemachus, the subject of the sentence, but instead you introduced this dependent clause, and that's potentially more interesting, right? It depends on what's around it and whether or not you're varying from one sentence type to another. But those dependent markers are a good way to introduce variation at the beginning of a sentence. Also, you want to be mindful of transition, right? So we utilize transitional words and phrases both to vary the rhythm of the sentences, so to introduce variation, but also to provide signposts for the reader. So these are kind of guideposts that link and provide information about how ideas relate to one another, right? So some of these you can imagine how they would relate to other things around them, right? So for instance, similarly, right? Similarly signals to the reader that you are making a point that conveys similarity to an earlier point that you made. Nevertheless, right? Nevertheless suggests that you have laid out some points or insights that potentially complicate a point of view or suggest that something might be otherwise, but nevertheless, X, Y, or Z, whatever the point is you want to make, regardless of these other things that I have introduced, this point still stands. On the contrary, would be suggesting in opposition to something that I have said previously, I am going to provide an insight or an idea here. So these are ways in which you both introduce sentences in ways that are interesting and engaging, but also help your reader work through and navigate the terrain that you're writing in. So here is an example. Regardless of whether the suitors understood the risks, their abuse of the kingdom's hospitality would have dire consequences, right? So perhaps prior to this sentence, there was some discussion of whether the suitors in the Odyssey understood that what they were doing was a violation of the norms of Ithaca and the norms of this kingdom and Greek civilization. But regardless of whether they understood it, doesn't really matter. That's besides the point. Their abuse of the hospitality would have dire consequences, right? So it's a way to relate ideas and also to just make things more interesting for your reader. Also, you have to think about verb choice, and sometimes the verbs that you use in your writing can be a function of sentence structure. And this example that I provide, actually I see a lot in undergraduate writing. And the problem with structuring your writing in this way, it's ironic because I've actually framed this exactly according to the thing I'm telling you not to do as I'm saying it. But the problem with this is that you end up using the verb is as your main verb, right? So here's the example. The problem with Telemachus is that he's too young to assume a position of power and leadership. Is a really boring verb, right? And there's a way to convey this insight, which is a good insight and an arguable point, right? There's a way to convey this insight that is more dynamic, more interesting, and enables you to use more interesting verbs. So here's an alternative that as a instructor, as somebody who grades a lot of writing, I would read and I would say it's a lot better. Telemachus's youth fosters insecurity, leaving him reluctant to assume a position of power and leadership. That's just so much better, right? Because you're using a verb, fosters. That's just so much better than is. And really, in all of your writing, you should do your best to avoid what we call the to-be verbs. So is, was, are, were. Try to avoid those verbs. They're just very boring. And there's always a way, usually by restructuring the sentence slightly, that you can convey the same idea, but you can use more interesting language to do it. And the other thing I would say is avoid repetition in verb choice. So even if you're conscious of not using is, sometimes there's just a phrasing or a verb that pops into your head and you use it over and over again in a paper, and there's always different ways to frame that. This isn't so much related to sentence structure, it's more related to style. But the key is to, after you've written a piece of work, whether it's relatively short or relatively long, to go through it and circle all the verbs and see if there are verbs that come up again and again. And if there are, think about ways that you could change them and have more variation in the verbs that you're using in your writing. Active voice versus passive voice. So active voice, the easiest way to explain it is just to present it to you. Passive voice, you kind of know it when you see it. So this is not grammatically wrong. It's not incorrect, right? And there are instances actually in which you would want to use passive voice rather than active voice. But some examples of passive voice versus active voice. If you were saying something in passive voice, you could say, it has been argued. Whereas active voice would be, the lecturer argued, right? Instead of making the idea the subject of the sentence, you make an individual the subject of a sentence. It was found that versus we found that. You're assigning ownership to the action. Passive voice tends not to do that. And there are some instances in which that's appropriate, right? There are some instances in which perhaps that information is unknown. And so you have to use passive voice because you can't assign a subject and be sure who is engaged in the action. But oftentimes in writing, we engage in passive voice in order to kind of be evasive, right? Or it can create a construction, language, that is hard to follow, right? So this can lead to unnecessarily complex language, or it can lead to evasive language in which it's not clear to the reader who is engaging in an action or who is responsible for an idea or an insight. So in that first example, it has been argued. Well, who? As the reader, my question would be who? Who has argued? Whereas in the alternative example, when it says the lecturer argued, I understand, oh, okay, this is a reference to this week's lecture. I know who they're talking about. Whereas in the passive voice, it has this amorphous kind of quality that makes it very hard to interpret who is actually responsible for the action. Now, as I said, it's not wrong. It's not grammatically incorrect to utilize passive voice, but it's just something you want to be cognizant of. And you want to be sure that if you are using passive voice, it is because the subject of the sentence would be unclear, or you want to direct attention to, the idea as opposed to the author of the idea. But just recognize that passive voice can be dangerous, and it can be a way that you're either evading assigning ownership to an action, or you are making your language too complex, and it might be difficult or confusing to your reader. So going back to the very beginning again, all of these tools are ways to get at clarity, variety, and transition. And it's important to recognize that the building blocks of sentence structure can actually help you achieve those goals. You have tools at your disposal in how you structure your sentences that help you to be clear, that help introduce variety into your reading that's going to sustain reader interest, and also help provide signposts and kind of a guide through your ideas as you move from one idea, one point to another, and just make the experience of transitioning a little bit less jarring for your reader, and hopefully a little bit easier to follow. So as I said, that's what I'm going to focus on for this week. Think about ways in which you can utilize sentence structure to achieve these goals of clarity, variety, and transition. And I look forward to reading your work. Thanks very much.